we wanted to bring you up to date and kind of tell you what's going on with the Ukraine situation. And before we get into the part I want to show you today that's new, I just always want to remind people there's a lot of reasons why this is happening in Ukraine. And it's not an act of naked aggression of, well, I don't know. Maybe it is naked. I don't know what even that means, naked. Or they're wearing clothes when they're doing this. So Nord Stream pipeline snarled in the U.S.-Russia fossil energy war. So there's a big pipeline that goes from Russia to Germany that was supposed to start up, get the liquid gas flowing, and they're providing a lot. So that's got more to do with this than anybody's letting on. So the United States doesn't want that pipeline happening. And so one of the conditions to get that pipeline to shut down was if Russia attacked Ukraine, Germany agreed that they would shut it down. So it looks like the Biden administration has done everything they could to get Putin to actually go into Ukraine. And what's another? So that's one reason. We're going to talk more about it later. Another reason is the NATO expansion, and people try to dismiss it, but it's real. And so this is from Salon. NATO leaves little room for diplomacy, how the war machine upped the ante in Ukraine. So, and why did the war machine want Ukraine to be a part of NATO? Because when you join NATO, you have to have a certain amount of military gear for your country. And so who sells it? The West. So that's why they wanted to get as many countries into NATO as they could after the Soviet Union fell, not because it would defend us from the Soviet Union, but because it would be a weapons sales for American military industrial complex. Also, in 2014, here's the third thing that led to this crisis. In 2014, the United States backed a coup of the democratically elected government in Ukraine because they were afraid that the Ukraine was too close with Russia, and they wanted Ukraine to come join the Europe and their economic system. And so we helped engineer a coup to overthrow that democratically elected government, and we got in bed with neo-Nazis to do it. So a big part of the support for the current Ukraine government is neo-Nazis, and that's not, I'll show you that for real. It's not a little thing. It's not small. It's a big deal. And so we tried to turn Ukraine into a vassal state, as you pointed out here, for the U.S. project of turning Ukraine into a vassal state while pretending to care about its sovereignty. You couldn't have picked a worse face than the guy who helped organize the coup of 2014 and then got his son a lucrative gas company board seat in the immediate aftermath. So that's what we're talking. So this is the stuff they're never telling you. Even on YouTube, they don't ever hardly bring this stuff up when they cover the Ukraine crisis. So that's really important. So this is where the crisis is. So there's the Ukraine, and there's the two separatist areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, and this is called the Donbass. And what's been going on since 2014, they wanted to separate from the Ukraine after the coup. They're like, we don't want to be ruled by people who overthrew our government. And so they started fighting. So the Ukraine forces are fighting the separatist forces in Donbass, and they were supposed to stop shelling them and killing them. Who was supposed to? The Ukraine. There was a ceasefire. It was called the Minsk agreements and part of the agreement was there would be a ceasefire. Ukraine would stop shelling that area and killing those people. They would have a military withdrawal, and then they would have elections in this area. They would have elections here, and these people would be giving more autonomy. None of that happened. None of that happened. So they're not abiding. So this didn't just come out of nowhere. There's a pipeline involved. There's the expansion of NATO involved. And there's the Minsk agreements and Ukraine shelling and killing these people. And nobody ever brings this up. So finally, after 8 years of them trying to negotiate, they wouldn't stop shelling them. So then Vladimir Putin stepped in under all of that happening. Okay, under all of that happening. And just to remind everybody, 1 in 6 Ukrainians is an actual ethnic Russian, and 1 in 3 speaks Russian as their native language. Okay. And so that leads me to anything you would like to, I'm here with Aaron Maté. Aaron, is there anything you'd like to add to that before I get to this video today?
Great summary. I'll just add that the obvious then solution for Ukraine's deep internal division throughout all of this has been apparent from the start. Instead of forcing Ukraine to choose one identity, because it has 2 very distinct identities. One of it is pro-Western, pro-US, wants to be tight with the EU. The other one is pro-Russian, to the point where, as you say, there's so many people who speak Russian. So the obvious answer when you have such a divided country is to keep it neutral. Don't force it to choose one side or the other, because that will lead to conflict. And for the last 8 years, starting with the coup in 2014, the U.S. has been leading the way to try to force Ukraine into one position. And that's a disaster because Russia is on its borders. And along with this bid to expand NATO into Ukraine, it was not going to let Ukraine become a U.S. military outpost on its borders and negating the attitudes and desires of the millions of people inside Ukraine who strongly identify with Russia. That's why the solution has always been to keep Ukraine neutral, but that has not been tolerable to Washington, D.C., and that's why we have this conflict right now.
So, and that's the parts you'll never hear almost anywhere else when you go to hear information about Ukraine. And so now here's a journalist, and he's going to be speaking to the a spokesperson for Russia, right? And so here, watch what his question is starts from today, as if history in the Donbass and Ukraine and Russia just started 2 days ago. And she reminds him that Ukraine has been shelling and killing these people without mercy, and they won't stop, and they're actual Nazis. Okay, here we go.
Launched an unprovoked attack on his southern neighbor that is killing a lot of Ukrainian.
So he calls it an unprovoked attack. So I just told you all that stuff. So for him to say that is propaganda off the top. Okay.
Cousins of Russia and Russian soldiers. What's your reaction to that description of his action?
And could you please say how many years must have this bloodshed gone on in eastern Ukraine? 5, 10 years? Why did you start counting victims only today, or say yesterday? Who gave you the right to ignore victims, especially we were talking about thousands of them over all these years? Isn't your conscience tormenting you when you Western journalists speculating on Minsk agreements and Russia never mentioned that in the eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk Republic, there are peaceful citizens losing lives every day. You never counted them, just like President Zelensky never considered them people. Who gave you the right to speak of the victims starting only today? If that's the way you create your reports, if that's your approach to it, you are not journalists and you're not people. All in all, according to OSCE, 13,000 people died, and OSCE had no opportunity to account for every victim. It's only their primary analysis. Where were you? Why didn't you ask these questions in Kiev? Why didn't you broadcast people in Donbass? Why did you give them no opportunity to attend international organizations meetings or join in online? You have no conscience at all. You shouldn't start counting with February 2022. This history is many years old. At least you should start with 2013. Did you count the people that died on Maidan in 2013, 2014? How many people died? How many people were killed by snipers? Have you ever reported on that? It's not for you to say that there's an operation conducted. It's not a beginning of a war. It's an operation to end a war which has been going on for many years. What you do is propaganda.
So what she's pointing out to that guy, why are you only starting to count deaths right now in February 2022? This didn't just start then. This is back in 2013. Why don't you count the number of deaths that happened when they overthrew the government in the Maidan coup? Why don't you count those deaths? Why don't you count the deaths that they've been shelling for the last 8 years? You don't count any of those deaths. Now, I can't show you. There's another video that accompanies this that shows you all the carnage that the Ukraine neo-Nazis have been inflicting on the areas of Donbass. I can't show you that on YouTube because it'll demonetize this video, if not completely shut it down, to pull it down. So, so there she was, the Russian spokesperson, smacking down a journalist correctly. Would you agree, Aaron?
Yeah, a lot of what she said is true. And we're not allowed to talk about those people in the Donbass, Jimmy, because they're unworthy victims, to use Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's term for manufacturing consent. Unworthy victims are victims who are killed with our support. And for the last 8 years, the U.S. has pumped billions of dollars into Ukraine to shell the people of the Donbass. And you and Max Blumenthal talked about this. According to UN figures tracking since 2018 in the Donbass, 80% of the civilian casualties are on the rebel-held side, 80%. And by the way, what prompted them to take up arms and to refuse to be a part of a coup regime-led Ukraine? It wasn't just the coup. Shortly after the coup, a few months later, something happened in a town called Odessa in Ukraine, where there was a massacre. Russian speakers were burned alive by fascists, burned alive, dozens of them inside a building. Those are unworthy victims. We're not allowed to talk about them or acknowledge their concerns. But that was a huge factor in leading to the Russian-speaking region in the Donbass to take up arms and to not want to be a part of a coup-led Ukraine. And that's what sparked this fighting for so long. And as you talked about, there have been solutions on the books in the Minsk Accords. It's been Kiev that's refused to implement them. And by the way, the Russian spokesperson mentioned the Maidan massacre. This was a very, very key event. There was after months of protests in the Maidan in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, by the way, what started out, a large part of those protests were legitimate. They were protesting a corrupt government, Yanukovych, and they were calling for democratic reforms. There's a lot to admire about what they did. But the problem is, as happens often, those protests got co-opted by far-right Nazi forces who turned it into a bid for violent regime change. And the zenith of that was when, to resolve the Maidan protest, to resolve the crisis, there was a negotiated settlement reached, brokered by European countries, in which the president, Yanukovych, would agree to new elections very, very soon and have curtailed powers. That was agreed with the opposition. The opposition leaders went back to the Maidan and met with the far-right leaders who told them, what the hell are you doing? We're not going to make an agreement with this guy. We want him out. And shortly after that, there was, as the spokesperson mentioned, a massacre of protests in Maidan. Snipers killing people, a lot of people. It was blamed on the Yanukovych government. And that then led to a series of more violent action that basically forced Yanukovych to flee. And that agreement that would have resolved this crisis was killed. The U.S., by the way, cheered when Yanukovych fled. It turns out there's been research done by a political scientist, Ukrainian, at the University of Ottawa, named Ivan Kachanovsky, based on forensic evidence, videos, speaking to witnesses, that shows pretty conclusively, and I'll tweet this out after this interview, that the shooting of these Maidan protesters came from a Maidan far-right fascist-controlled area, that they were the ones killing their own people to try to spark an event that could lead to a violent overthrow of the government, and that's exactly what happened. There also was a leaked phone call, which I'll tweet out too, in which two top European officials discuss that this massacre was very likely carried out by the far-right Maidan leaders. We're also not allowed to acknowledge that evidence, and that's why in the West, if you talk about the Maidan massacre, it's always blamed on the Ukrainian government that was overthrown. Ukrainian government was overthrown, Yanukovych fled, and guess what happened? A new government was installed, and who led it? A guy named Yatsenyuk. And why do we know, what's his significance? Well, 2 weeks earlier, as you alluded to with Victoria Nuland in that leaked phone call, Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piet, decided that Yatsenyuk would be the leader of the new Ukrainian government. And that's exactly who took over once Yanukovych fled the country.
Okay. So now you know the rest of the story, and there's even more to it than that, okay? So again, I'm stunned by the horrible reporting. I mean, it's worse than happened around Iraq or Libya. It's crazy, the reporting that's happened. And I think it's because they have it mixed up with Putin. And so people have Putin on the brain. By the way, Putin was another invention of the United States. So let's go to now. Here's some more new information. So there's that video, which is new information. And now there's this, which is also being brought to my attention. This is from 2016.
2019, I made a mistake. It's
2019, Pentagon tied RAND. So RAND works as an extension of the Pentagon, RAND Corporation. Study noted that if the United States increases military support for Ukraine, quote, Russia might respond by mounting a new offensive and seizing more Ukrainian territory. In the years since, Trump and then Biden increased U.S. weapons to Ukraine, and now Russia has invaded. So it's almost like, if you didn't know nothing, you would think that it's like the United States wanted this to happen. And son of a gun, it did. Here's what it says. It says, the Ukrainian military is bleeding Russia in the Donbass region and vice versa. providing more U.S. military equipment and advice could lead Russia to increase its direct involvement in the conflict and the price it pays for it. Russia might respond by mounting a new offensive and seizing more Ukrainian territory. So there it is. They'd known this was coming. They did everything they could to force his hand. By casually meddling in Ukraine politics, the United States has effectively incited Russia to undertake its reckless invasion. Putin richly deserves the opprobrium currently being heaped on him, but U.S. policy has been both careless and irresponsible. And that's from Andrew Besevich. Besevich. And who is he?
He is a U.S. Army veteran, writes often on issues of U.S. warfare, served for a long time. His son died in Iraq. And he's pointing out just what we're not allowed to acknowledge, that whatever you think of Putin's invasion, and again, as I said to you on your show the other night, I think it's illegal, and I think Putin had a lot of other options to deal with the attacks on Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. I don't think that this was the answer. Although I'd love to hear, if there's a counter-argument, I'd love to hear what the counter-argument is. But he's pointing out the obvious, that the U.S. played a major role in inciting Putin's action, and that, again, the key point, as you stressed, this war did not start with Putin's invasion. Putin escalated it, but the war began 8 years ago when the U.S. backed a coup and put its weight behind a coup government that waged war on Ukraine's Russian-speaking population.
And also because of the pipeline, and also because of NATO. And here's proof of it. Here's Adam Schiff bragging that they're arming the people that Putin is fighting in the Donbass. He's bragging about it. Watch this.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
There it is. So there, I mean, we've been pushing for this for a while, and I want to show you, this is an article by, I think, Norman Solomon, and he's talking about how NATO's push we promised that NATO would not expand after Germany reunified. We promised Russia and Putin. And then we've completely, 12 more countries. Here it is. As Cockburn notes, by 2014, the 12 new members of NATO had purchased. So the reason why, I told you that at the top, and the reason, why did they want to expand NATO if Russia wasn't a threat anymore after like 1991? The reason why they wanted to expand NATO is because the military-industrial complex, there's certain rules. If you join NATO, you have to have a certain size military with certain size armaments. And where are they going to get that? They have to go buy it from the United States military-industrial complex. So, and that's why they wanted to expand NATO, not because it was going to keep anybody safer, because it doesn't, because there's no threat anymore. The reason why they wanted to expand NATO was so they could make more money selling armaments to those new countries that had to then just got inducted into NATO. That's what this is also about. So as Cockburn notes, by 2014, the 12 new members of NATO had purchased close to $17 billion worth of American weapons. If you think those weapons transactions were about keeping up with the Russians, you've been trusting way too much U.S. corporate media. As of late 2020, Cockburn's book explains that NATO's collective military spending had hit $1.03 trillion, or roughly 20 times what Russia's military budget is. So that's not why we're arming them. We're arming them for just straight up cash, and that's where it comes from.
Jimmy,
yes, go ahead.
So what the article is quoting is Andrew Coburn, who is a great British journalist. He's the Washington editor for Harper's Magazine. And he's quoting from Coburn's newest book. It's called Spoils of War. And I recently interviewed Coburn for my show, Pushback. And one of the people who Coburn interviews for his book is a guy named Bruce Jackson. And in the late 1990s, Bruce Jackson was the head of something in Washington called the Committee to Expand NATO. So that was the group that Bruce Jackson was heading. Guess what Bruce Jackson's day job was, Jimmy?
He worked at a missile company, I'm guessing?
He was the vice president of Lockheed Martin. I'm not joking. Wow. So the vice president of Lockheed Martin was also the president of a group called the Committee to Expand NATO, because that's who benefits from NATO expansion.
And just to drive it home again, I can't believe other people, even on YouTube, aren't hardly ever bringing this up. But here it is. And this is from the ambassador to Russia back when Russia fell apart. I was there, NATO and the origins of the Ukraine crisis. After the fall of the Soviet Union, I told the Senate that expansion would lead us to where we are today. And who's saying that? Jack F. Matlock Jr., who had a great TV show, but also is a great diplomat. He said Putin's demands is that the process of adding new members to NATO cease and that Russia has assurances that Ukraine and Georgia will never be members. President Biden has refused to give such assurance, but made clear his willingness to continue discussing questions of strategic stability in Europe. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has made it clear it has no intention of implementing the Minsk agreements reached in 2015 for reuniting the Donbass province into Ukraine with a large degree of local autonomy, an agreement with Russia, France, and Germany that the United States endorsed. So some people say, when I tell them this about how Russia just wants assurances that they say, oh, come on, Jimmy, Germany and France are against Ukraine getting into NATO. And so, and even Ukraine says they don't want to, so it'll never happen. Hey, the United States gets what it wants. So just keep that in mind. If the United States pushes hard enough, they're going to get anything they want. And so don't put it past that wouldn't happen. And that's why this guy is saying what he's saying, and I think he knows a lot about it. Would you like to say anything on that, Adam? Or Aaron, what's your name? I don't know what your name is.
Jack Matlock is not allowed to appear on corporate media because what he says is too inconvenient, even though he was the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, was there at the most critical time in history when the Soviet Empire collapsed, helped basically negotiate the end to the Cold War. He's not allowed because his insight is too inconvenient. So whatever, he's confined to the margins.
And again, this you see all over the media and YouTube, even people saying this is 100% Putin's doing, 100%. It's just like you guys are such children on purpose. Honest to God, everywhere you go, I'm not kidding. Look, pick a YouTube show, throw a dart. Every fucking one of them, from Kyle Kalinske to the goddamn shit Young Turks and everybody in between saying the same shit. Jackson Hinkle's getting it correct. The Grayzone is getting it correct. And so just to drive this home, here's Noam Chomsky before COVID, so it was before he lost his mind. And here he is going to let you know what the real point of NATO is in the first place. Here's the real point of NATO since 1991.
The question that we ought to be asking ourselves is, why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a US-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global U.S. intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
So I hope that people appreciate this information. Again, I just want to give you real quick about the pipeline that I teased up top. So there's a pipeline.
Okay, really quickly, let me just say one thing.
Okay.
Let's take a second to acknowledge the insane hypocrisy of all these warmongers right now, who spent the last 5 years hyperventilating over Russia allegedly stealing some emails from Hillary Clinton and putting out some social media memes on Twitter and Facebook. Okay, they were comparing this to Pearl Harbor at 9/11. They see nothing wrong with flooding Ukraine with billions of dollars in weapons and trying to bring it into a hostile military alliance on Russia's borders. The delusional hypocrisy of these people is stunning. And Russiagate, the thing we opposed for 4 years because it was so insane, has brought us to this moment right now. It's completely normalized the insane chauvinism that is driving this war right now.
100%, yes. So here is that the pipeline was built to send gas directly from Russia to Germany, bypassing Ukraine and removing a source of income as well as a strategic choke point for the former Soviet state. In Europe, the debate over U.S. sanctions is viewed as a play not only for energy security, but for lucrative energy markets, violating territorial sovereignty even as they claim to preserve it. Sanctions are an aggressive instrument in a fossil energy war, Claudia Kempfert, an energy economist, told a German newspaper. She said both Russia and the United States are using natural gas as a political weapon. So that's a big deal because the United States wants to get that natural gas market for us in the United States and not give it up to Russia, which then will control even bigger percentage of the energy, and they will give them more control in Europe. So now I think they have it at 30%. Well, God damn it, why didn't I look this up before? But it's either 30 or 40% of Europe's energy comes from Russia. And so that's what this is about. And if you don't support it, if you don't support Ukrainian Nazis, you're a right-winger. That's what people are saying right now. We're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, and Houston, and Addison, and back in Tampa, Des Moines, Omaha. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets for all our live shows. See you there.